Dr. Mitchell, what does it feel like to walk on the moon?
The physical feeling is very much like walking on a trampoline, kind of bouncy, and that kind of be how it feels like.
It's Sunday, June the 18th. It's Father's Day. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Barry Shainbaum on Faith FM. My guest this morning on the line from Florida is Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is one of the people in my book, Hoping Heroes. On January 31st, 1971, Navy Captain Dr. Edgar Mitchell embarked on a journey into outer space, the sixth man to walk on the moon. The Apollo 14 mission was NASA's third manned lunar landing. This historic journey ended safely 9 days later on February 9th, 1971. This was an audacious time in the history of mankind. Although for Dr. Mitchell, however, the most extraordinary journey was yet to come. Good morning, Dr. Mitchell.
Good morning, Barry. How are you this morning?
I'm fine, and how are you?
Just doing great, thanks.
Being the sixth man to walk on the moon and go into space, how did it change your life?
Well, the part that really changed my life was seeing Earth from space and recognizing got to do more to be good stewards of Earth and better citizens of Spaceship Earth.
You also had an epiphany on the way back about the interconnectedness of all life.
On the way home, my job was primarily done since my responsibilities were being lunar module pilot, responsible for the lunar spacecraft, and the lunar service activities. So when we'd successfully completed those, I had a reasonably light workload coming home and could look out and be a tourist looking out the window. And we were oriented such that and rotating in order to keep thermal balance on the spacecraft, so that every 2 minutes we could see the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and the 360-degree panorama of stars. And that was very powerful. And from my training in astronomy, I knew that the molecules of our bodies, those molecules in the spacecraft, and all the matter we know was manufactured in some ancient generation of stars. And suddenly that, instead of intellectual knowledge, became very visceral. Those were my molecules that had been out there. And there was a connection with all of that scenery I was looking at. There was suddenly a visceral experience of connectedness, feeling connected, feeling ecstatic. And it wasn't until many months later in doing research, trying to find out what the world went on here, that I discovered in the ancient Sanskrit the description that goes back a few thousand years, where you see things in their separateness and their individuality, but to experience them viscerally as a unity, oneness, and accompanied by ecstasy, and it was called samadhi in the ancient Sanskrit. And it was a powerful experience. It's a life-changing thing. Once that happens, there's no going back.
And when you came back to Earth, you looked to find like-minded people. And it was a bit challenging, right?
I believe this is an evolutionary characteristic that more and more people will experience it. As you become thoughtful, as you turn inward to look at inner experiences and do meditation, for example, these are kind of the natural consequences of doing all of that.
In your training at NASA for so many years, in all your training courses and manuals, was there ever anything on what it might feel like and how you might change when you come back from an experience like that?
No, that was kind of serendipity. There was quite a number of us had those type of experiences. We describe them somewhat differently, but in discussion with the guys, I know we've all had a very similar experience. At that time, there was certainly nothing in the science literature to describe all of this. But now, as we have started to approach this in later years with quantum physics and more scientific techniques and methods of understanding what goes on in the brain-body, we're starting to understand it better.
My guest on the line from West Palm Beach, Florida, is Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, and the date was January 31st, 1971. Dr. Mitchell, what does it feel like to walk on the moon?
Well, the physical feeling is very much like walking on a trampoline, because you're in 1/6 gravity, 1/6 of what we experience here. So it's kind of bouncy. And unfortunately, though, you see, you're encumbered by pressure suits and all the regalia that we had to wear, so that in Earth weight, we were well over 400 pounds, body weight plus equipment. But on the moon, that was roughly 72 to 75 pounds. So we felt a lot lighter. One example I tell to children when they ask about this is it's like going outside and playing in the snow with about 4 or 5 snowsuits or overcoats on. You can't move very well, but then walking on a trampoline, it would add to that, and that kind of be how it feels like.
Thank you. What do you say to people who say that the first lunar landing was actually faked in a television studio somewhere in the States because of issues of light and shadow, and they don't think it happened?
Well, unfortunately, we have a lot of people like that, but there's a great website that deals with all of the proposed objections, and it's called badastronomy.com, who've answered virtually all of the negations. I frankly won't waste my time on it.
Okay. Dr. Mitchell, how did your belief in a higher power before you walked on the moon compare to your belief after walking on the moon and coming back?
Well, good question, Barry. I was raised in a very fundamentalist religious Christian family. As I've become older and looked around and studied, I've questioned the tenets of all of that and questioned the stories. But certainly when I went to the moon and came back, I recognized the interconnection that all the mystics, ancient mystics, have talked about. My understanding today is not like the traditional mystics. I don't believe in the grandfather figure sitting in the heavens pulling the puppet strings of life, but more the interconnected creative intelligence in the universe. I describe the universe that we're in from my studies as being self-organizing, intelligent, creative, learning, trial and error, interconnected, non-locally, informationally interconnected, learning universe. All of those words are necessary to explain all that we see going on. I do consider what many would call, or most would call, a higher order of reality, or a higher power, if you will. And the idealist, from which all religious notions come, considers that consciousness is the fundamental stuff. And the modern evidence would suggest that the reality lies somewhere in between, and both our scientific materialism is a flawed concept, and our archaic, ancient mythologies about our origins are archaic and flawed as well. And that was a part of my space experience, was to recognize from looking at Earth and the heavens from space that now that we're a spacefaring civilization, we need to rethink and reorganize and restudy these deep ancient questions of who are we, how did we get here, and where are we going. That was a part of the space experience, was to recognize that at this point in history, since we are the first to go off our planet, that we need to rethink these ancient questions that have been around forever. And I would remind our listeners that in the early 50s, when we first started thinking about going into space, in the late 50s when we started to actually do it, the common understanding of our universe was very simplistic. God in the heavens, man in the middle, and everything else below. And only these days, with the powerful telescopes that we have and the new orbiting sensors that we have, are we starting to be able to reach deep into the universe and start to get a real picture of what this is all about.
Dr. Mitchell, do you have a personal feeling or view on how the universe was created?
The evidence that is starting to emerge, and it's very, very new, it's on the frontiers. There is some new work that I have done and some of my colleagues have done, particularly in Europe, that shows how order and form can arise out of the so-called zero-point energy field that is the medium that inhabits space. A long, long time ago, back at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, an experiment was conducted called the Michelson-Morley experiment, which attempted to measure the speed of light in different directions as we went around the sun. And that experiment erroneously came to the conclusion that since the speed of light was measured the same in all directions, space had to be totally empty. And that simply isn't true. That seemed to banish the ether that was thought to pervade space at that time. But we know that there's enormous quantum fluctuations and residual energy in deep space, and we call that the zero-point energy field. And it's the source It's the source of all matter. It's the source of how this came about. There's a lot of people, a lot of scientists now beginning to question the Big Bang as really the answer to this. The new ways of looking at it are showing that matter, or at least the images or the holographic energies or patterns of matter, can arise spontaneously out of the zero-point energy field. Now, there's a lot of work that needs to be done before that's validated, but that's what's coming along.
Dr. Mitchell, do you feel in the next few years there will be proof that there is life on other planets?
Well, let's divide that into two questions. Is there life in the rest of the universe? And I think many of us have been thinking there is for a long time. But actually, in my opinion, and from what I know and have been briefed, we have already been visited. This is not new knowledge. It's been hidden knowledge for quite some time and been covered up for quite some time by most of our governments. From my knowledge, although I have no personal first-hand experience at this point, I have been briefed by knowledgeable people in government and in the intelligence communities that presumably had to know. And many of these folks I call old-timers because they've been around a bit longer than I have.
And we're talking about the landing in Roswell, New Mexico, correct?
That's one of them. Yeah, that's one of them. The Roswell incident is one. And that was a valid incident. And there are others that have been. There are even modern people that I've been interfaced with in military and intelligence who confirm these ideas. There's a lot of nonsense out there, too. But in basic reality, yes, we've been visited.
What is it going to take for U.S. governments or other governments to acknowledge what many people know as fact?
Well, I don't think people really know as fact. They think so. I don't know. We've tried to get this opened up, and I think it's going to take place here before too long. We can't ignore this much longer. So it's starting to happen.
And when you were up on the module or other flights, have you experienced any phenomena?
No, we have not. None, at least up through the Apollo program. We didn't really have anything corroborated or anything validated. There were some sightings that were not understood initially, but all were subsequently properly understood. But there haven't really been, up through the time I was flying and up to even through the Apollo-Soyuz flight, the people that I know personally, I have not had any in-space experiences.
With the landing in Roswell, New Mexico, can you tell us more what you learned from, quote, the old-timers on what or who was recovered from the crash?
Well, I can only say there were bodies recovered, and presumably there have been some alive aliens that have been in cooperation with some of the research people. That much I can, but there is so much misinformation and disinformation that it's very hard to really sort out exactly what has happened.
What do you feel will happen to institutions like the Vatican and organized world religions when the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times has pictures on the front page, proof of life from other planets? What's going to happen to our religious structure here on planet Earth?
Well, I think that there's the ability to accommodate that if they choose to. But let's go back. You asked an interesting question. You see, in my own research, I came to realize many years ago, all religion comes out of these transcendent type experiences, and where people have this type of insightful, mystical experience. I don't like that word, mystical, but experience of otherworldly things or new insights. And let's call it a transcendent experience. And when that happens, and it's happened, as it turns out, in every culture of the world, let's call that the esoteric experience. It's when you start to understand this connectedness that I've talked about and others have talked about. But when you try to explain this, it's a very difficult concept to explain to those who have not had it. And so the words all get twisted. They come out in different ways. Let's call the explanation of the esoteric experience, let's call that the exoteric explanation. The exoteric explanation of the esoteric experience is what results in religion. The experience is the same everywhere, but the ability to express it becomes enculturated and culturally dependent and language dependent. And so we end up a few thousand years later having had these experiences in ancient times in every culture of the world, but we end up fighting over whose explanation, or that is, whose God is the best God. And that's where this all comes from. And as a result, from my point of view at least, all of our traditions and our science are going to have to move forward and start to understand these beginnings and these psychological and mystical and inner experiences quite differently than they've been expressed in the past.
What do you feel is the purpose of suffering? And there is so much suffering on the planet.
Because we don't have the wisdom, the insight, or the compassion to change it. And in most cases, I will say, we're just barely out of the trees. We are very primitive people. We think we're civilized. And in some areas, the last couple of centuries, our scientific genius has outrun our moral and ethical value system. By and large, we've produced, over the centuries, a lot of greed, self-service, ego satisfaction. But it turns out that service to the greater good is really what it's all about. And we do not have many civilizations oriented towards service to the greater good. Individuals have to need to look beyond themselves, need to look to new ideas, need to look to the new sciences to help to understand how our world is put together. We humans are going to have to leave this planet, provided we don't kill ourselves off in the meantime. And that's thinking long range, but we've got to start thinking in big terms, big picture terms, thinking long range, and recognize that all any of us can do as individuals is start to change ourselves and to see ourselves as a part of the solution, not a part of the problem, and act accordingly.
Dr. Edgar Mitchell, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Beth.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives with Barry Shainbaum. You can subscribe on Spotify and on YouTube for more perspectives.